The status quo is one in which the barrier of language stands as a mile-high mortar wall. It is a reality that systemically blocks people from prosperity and upliftment. By the conditions of birth, individuals in developing countries are isolated in communities that are homogenous in their language, deprived of the choice to speak and engage beyond this predestined bubble. We popped that bubble on side proposition, starting this speech with 3 notes on framing. Firstly, to clarify our stance. We advocate for the adoption of a world language that lots of people speak, likely English, but we're open to other languages as well. This would be mandated in schools across the board. I think Singapore is a fantastic example of what this would probably look like. Secondly, to clarify, the most likely iteration or result of our world is one in which the majority of people in these nations are bilingual. We think there are lots of cultural incentives to continue to speak your native language at home, the same way people maintain traditions when they move abroad. You do not lose your culture when you are taught an additional language on our side of the house. Thirdly, we would note that on side opposition, lots of wealthy international and private educational institutions already do this and will continue to do this because it is a huge part of how they market themselves. This means that the wealthiest people in countries with emerging economies already access world languages and the opportunities that they bring. The change on our side then is just whether more accessible institutions adopt these curriculums, whether the majority of people in these nations are able to learn from them. First argument is on the economic benefit of teaching world language. And the thesis here is that on our side of the house, people go to opportunities and opportunities come to people. The first layer is on individual social mobility. We think that in the status quo, people are stripped of autonomy when their language barrier locks them out of the opportunity or the ability to leave their hometown and seek lucrative opportunities. If you are born into an area without a plethora of lucrative employment opportunities, areas that are slightly more rural, slightly less interconnected, but pretty common in developing nations, but you only know the language that locale speaks, you can never get out because you are not employable, not only to other countries, but to the major city centers near you, which have markets dominated by foreign-owned companies and thousands of employees who know a language you don't. Our side removes this barrier, empowering individuals to move within their capacity to do so in search of careers within the country, but also to seek opportunity abroad, for example, apply to prestigious universities in wealthy countries or immigrate in search of work. Opposition may, and reasonably so, be concerned about brain drain at this point in the debate, but the second layer under this argument addresses this pretty well. Our second layer here talks about an influx of opportunities. We think that more lucrative careers come into the area on our side of the house in the very first place. There is an employment basis and a labor force that foreign-owned companies can access. This is really important to them when they're deciding where to locate, where they're likely to be the most profitable. Because most companies like being international. They have these incentives to expand. They want to expand their reach, but this is only true when they can easily market to the people in an area, when they can hire people into the areas that they move into, when they can build from the ground up. This is why Singapore, for example, has so many international companies, such a big international finance market. It is because the people there are very, very accessible to international companies when they are looking to establish themselves. This leads to less volatile and more lucrative jobs. It disincentivizes things like brain drain and increases stability in these countries because people now have opportunities that didn't exist before. You have really big companies coming in and utilizing a labor force that fundamentally was not there. Third point under this argument then is on tourism, and this is pretty simple. World languages make areas more accessible to tourists. It makes people more likely to want to go there because they know that they can enjoy more things. This is a huge capital influx. It's a lot of money that comes into these areas. Tourism means that you get a lot of money that can fuel development and increase quality of life. So we thought that that was important too. But before I move into our second argument on promoting social unity,
As you point out, many people in the developing world are bilingual. Unfortunately, they are bilingual in 2 local languages. Tamil people in India speak Tamil and Hindi. Isn't the burden of having to learn a third language of English on top of this far too high and restricting access?
No, we don't think so at all. We think that when these schools teach this language, it's very likely that people will be able to learn these languages. It's also much better for these countries when people are unified in the languages that they speak in that regard as well. I'll explain this in this argument, because we think that their side was quite likely to be unstable because of the same language divisions they just pointed out. We think that due to arbitrary colonial borders, emerging economies are often quite heterogeneous. They have populations of a variety of ethnicities, a variety of cultural backgrounds, and crucially, speaking a variety of of native languages. India, for example, has hundreds of dialects. It is actually not the case that all of these people know all of the languages that everybody else speaks there. Two scenarios can then exist. Either there is fragmentation as a result of linguistic nationalism. So each region rallies around their own language. This can be very divisive. For example, in India, the Bengali and Tamil people push for self-rule. It is very difficult to get along and come to compromise. But the reason why we think language is uniquely the decisive factor in fueling these tensions, rather than other differences that may exist between these populations, is that it prevents intermingling in a very concrete way. You literally cannot talk to these other people. That means it is very easy to demonize them, to other them, to see them as different from you. On our side, we think we got communication, we got connections that were likely to ameliorate these concerns. The other possibility for their side exists when there is a very strong majority population with a strong majority language, but there are small ethnic minorities that are sidelined. We think that when there is a sizable majority, they use their language to lock minorities out of jobs and out of capital. Governments in these cases always want to standardize, right? On a convenience basis, they are going to print signs, release memos in standardized languages. They're going to default to the majority language in a lot of cases, especially when ethnic and linguistic minorities are very, very small. But then these people, who are very important, are persecuted and shut out of access to institutions. The majority is able to dominate through their linguistic supremacy. We solve for two reasons. Firstly is that we provide a common basis for communication. This fosters goodwill, and that was really important. Just allowing these people to talk to each other, to coexist in a way that was less concrete, less identified, meant that they were very likely to form, reasonably good relationships. But secondly, we got greater equality, and this is really important, because what happened was the adoption of a world language meant that these minorities felt a lot less persecuted. They were not uniquely being shut out. They were not uniquely being shut out by standardization. When the government standardized, they could standardize to a local or to a world language rather than preferring the majority in every instance. So minorities felt less persecuted because the majority wasn't recognized over them. Ultimately, this meant a culture that fostered growth and development over fracturing and stagnation, because ethnic tension and linguistic tension is really, really harmful for economies that are trying to build themselves up to work together towards something more. This meant an economy that could grow and bring wealth to the most marginalized people, and it meant access to a literal world of opportunity, to jobs that did not exist yet, to careers that people were locked out of accessing in the status quo. We thought it was always good for people to have access to another tool to pursue what is going to be best for them. We thought it was always good for people to be educated in a way that was going to set them up for success later in life. That is why we've never been prouder to propose.
We thank the speaker for those eloquent remarks. Now we'd like to call the first opposition speaker to the podium.
All right, just checking that this volume is fine. Great, thanks.
Just give us 1 second.
Yeah, sure. This debate is about two different worlds. The world of the proposition doesn't exactly look like Singapore, because Singapore, I think, is the vast minority and had a bunch of other good stuff going for it. More realistically, what the world of the proposition looks like is countries like India and countries like Sri Lanka that, through an attempt to try to create unity by engaging in foreign language imposition, have created a stark divide between the urban community and the rural community, locking the vast majority of people out of accessing education at all. What our side looks like is Vietnam, What our side looks like is China, a country that has gone ahead and through the imposition of a national language been able to develop and pull even the poorest of people out of rural areas and into areas where they're able to gain education. That can only happen in a world where you do not structurally lock them out through the linguistic barrier that they say is a mile high. I want to note that your local language is extremely important. It governs your work, your government, your society, your news broadcast, access to public and private jobs, and so on. As a result, we think focusing on a language that is almost completely unfamiliar to the vast majority of the population is extremely harmful. What does our comparative look like? We pick the most widely spoken language in a nation and create that as the primary source of primary medium of education. It's what education and syllabi are determined on our side. It's what non-language subjects are taught on the basis of. You can still learn world languages as a subject on our side of the house, the same way most schools already mandate that you study some sort of foreign language. It's just not the medium of education. In countries that are so large that they have large regions with lots of dominant languages, like India, we are happy to have broad divisions. So in the north of India, you could have Punjabi and you could have Hindi. In the south of India, you would have Tamil and Telugu. But we think that this is much different to going ahead and imposing one big world language across the entire nation. Proposition needs to support a world, not where this was done from the beginning of time, but where countries that have up to this point imposed a national language switch right now and the harms that come about with it. This is also likely to be what is used in higher education entrance exams and things of that sort. In higher education, we're happy to do things like give people increased access to a foreign language, but we don't think that it's the main form of medium of education. Two quick responses before argument. Firstly, on their argument in terms of opportunities. Even if the foreign language exists in city centers, the majority of people in a city still speak the local language. In fact, I want to point out why brain is exactly such an issue. Because from the perspective of a foreign company, it is much easier to pull people out of a nation and keep them as your employees than go into a nation, set up production in its entirety and make sure that that opportunity exists. Which is why we think brain drain is much more likely on their side of the house. But if the issue is things like communication with other countries and things like tourism, you can still learn some English on the job, especially in tourism when the amount of English you need is actually quite minimal. We don't think you need to study your entire life in English to be able to do so. On to their second argument on instability, I'm going to flip this. Think about how much worse this gets when regions in India no longer are even given the opportunity to maintain their local language through the education system. We think that what is much more of a divider is class, and we will prove in our argumentation that class is what ensures that on their side the poorest of the poor continue to be locked out. Before I go ahead, yeah.
Class is likely to be symmetric. The richest communities on your side of the house can also educate people to the greatest extent. We equalize it because both minorities and majorities have equal access to the same language.
Not true, because minorities have been speaking the local language just as long as the majorities have. That is the difference. First argument as to why you reduce access to education. I want to note something very important, which is that in developing countries, people are already constantly dropping out of school because of the prevalence of child labor, and even though developing countries focus on education, the sheer scale of poverty means that there is still a large cost to parents. Even the cost of buying basic things like uniforms and stationery is massive for people in developing countries compared to people in developed countries. Why then does the incentive to enter and continue school go into the ground on their side? Four structural reasons. One, there is a massive time lag. World languages are massively foreign, especially to rural areas. The problem then on their side is that you have to be taught the language before you can learn anything else like numeracy. The problem then is that you then have to wait much longer to be able to learn any useful skills, which is when we think parents are more likely to pull their kids out of school because they feel they will gain more from working them in the fields or putting them in the sweatshops. Second, the burden on parents is far greater because in all education systems you rely on parents to teach you the basics. The problem is, up to this point, your parents have studied in the local language panel, which means there's a higher burden for the poorest of parents who now have to send their kids to after school tuition to even be able to get some of the benefit. But third, it hurts late beginners. In developing countries, most people start school very, very late because their parents have to save up money to be able to send them to school at all. The problem is now, for these people who have started late, they are unlikely to have had any exposure to the foreign language, and thereby will be at a constant disadvantage where they are never able to progress and constantly undermined. But fourth and finally, it undermines poorer children because even if they are good, they are likely to believe that they will never be as good because they do not have access to the world language into their day-to-day day life, which means that they do not even attempt going to school and their parents can justify pulling them out. What then is the comparative? The local language is far more accessible because you already speak it. Even if you are a minority, we think it is much more accessible than the world language they want on their side. One, because historically even minorities in these nations have learned this language, so there is some sort of basis, versus their side has to completely undo everything we've gotten up to now and start from scratch. Two, there is linguistic similarity. Groups that live close together and languages close together are likely much easier to learn. Quick example, Hindi 1-2 is ek do. In Sinhala, it's eka deka. This is very, very easy to be able to get across different languages. What's much harder is to learn the syntax and vocabulary of languages from across the world that came about because of colonialism. Three, these have been the most proliferated even before colonialism. Because even before colonialism, there were racial majorities in areas that did go ahead and engage in trade to spread their languages. And even during colonialism, we think missionaries conducted their missionary work in local languages. The same way that missionaries in Japan printed the Bible in Japanese. But fourthly, there's much more likely to be migration within your country that gives you access than migration abroad that is likely to have given you access in the past. What is the importance of this argument? It is much easier to access school at all on our side of the house panel, and you are more likely to complete school rather than dropping out. We think, yes, maybe foreign companies want to give you job opportunities, but they're more likely to do so if you don't speak English and have a full education than if you don't have a full education and can speak some English. That is the comparative panel, which means we are more likely to get job opportunities. Second argument as to the quality of education. I want to note in developing countries, educational resources are given on the basis of merit. This is because the education ministry and government wants to get positive incentives among schools, and because the preference or like the performance in public exams is numerical and something you can very easily use to justify trade-offs. The problem then is that richer urban students have more access to world languages. They've historically been more prevalent because of colonialism in these areas and foreign companies, and the fact that your parent likely went to an international school. What does this mean? You create a vicious cycle where the already privileged students get most of the government budget funneled into their schools, continuing to get better and better. We're not saying you shut down rural schools entirely, but they will continue to get systematically defunded on their side of the house. What is the comparative? Rural students can much more easily access the other local language than they can access a foreign language. We can recognize it will be hard on both sides, but it is much easier on our side when you can do things like access local resources. Even if you are in a rural area, you are likely to find someone who speaks the local language, even if you are a minority, as opposed to having to import teachers from the urban center to be able to teach you on their side of the house. The importance of this is simple. We give you a more usable education panel and we don't structurally discriminate. For all of these reasons, oppose.
We thank the speaker for those wonderful remarks, and before I call on the next speaker, we have to figure out the AC or else we will open. Are we sure it's on? Like, it's definitely.
Alright, everyone good? I don't think that side opposition's first speaker was right about a lot of things, but the one thing that he was right about is that we do live in two completely different worlds. And what do those two different worlds look like? On our side of the house, we get what Singapore looks like, where from the moment of independence, they invested millions, if not billions of dollars with teaching people, regardless of class, regardless of where you live, things like English, to make sure that people, regardless of their cultural groups, had the same access to education, same access to language. What did their side of the house look like? It looked like where the 70 to 80% of Mandarin speakers made Mandarin the dominant language in schools. And why was that bad? Because for the little Tamil kid who for the first 5 years of his life was learning Tamil, he had no idea why his Mandarin peer was always beating him out in the language classes and always consistently outperforming them. Their side was a world of inequality where majority languages like Hindi, like Chinese, completely dominated over minority groups. Our side was the only risk of solvency, where regardless of your class, regardless of your geographical location, regardless of your religion, you had the same access to the same language and the same educational opportunities. We're the only side that had a risk toward equality. Three major clarifications before I go into the two key clashes of this debate and a third substantive argument. The three key characterizations. First of all, in a POI, they say you're going to have to learn Tamil, Hindi, and English. You probably won't have to learn Hindi insofar as now English becomes the national standard, not things like Hindi. They had no fiat to argue that people learn massive additional languages. Second of all, we argue that it wasn't so simple for them to just snap their fingers and argue that all these developing countries were highly homogenous and majoritarian and everyone spoke the same language. We told you the developing countries were likely to be heterogeneous, and the reason was because developing countries were drawn by arbitrary colonial boundaries where tons of people with different languages and ethnic groups were grouped in the same region. This means that there's a high level of fragmentation, and they never, ever, ever get the same type of unity and national cohesion that we get. That is a stunning concession that we get out of the O1. But finally, the worst thing that we get out of the O1 is a case that is completely contingent on model quibbles. Listen to their rhetoric. They're like, all these people don't know this language. They're going to be very unfamiliar with it, and there's going to be a time lag. Guys, be reasonable. What's going to happen on our side of the house is not like every 18-year-old in Vietnam now has to take their standardized tests in English. There's a gradual pilot program that occurs where people starting from kindergarten now have to learn things like English. You spend billions of dollars taking out the languages that currently exist and investing in things like English teachers and investing in things like more resources. This was going to be a gradual program. So teachers had parents had no incentive to pull their kids out of school because the time lag didn't exist. Everyone had equal access to English. I want to note that this was a massive strategic mistake for them. They banked way too much of their substantive arguments on this time lag and model quibble, and this one point of framing takes out the majority of their offense. We are so far ahead in this round. Go ahead.
Okay, this debate is not about from the inception of independence about these nations. It's about imposing it right now. Given that these people have already learned the local language for so long, why isn't there going to be massive costs in terms of changing it?
This is so ridiculous, right? It's not like you snap your finger and now all the textbooks are in English. It's going to be a gradual process where a certain generation of youngsters starts to learn English, and over time, as the country develops, more and more people learn that language. Guys, you knew that this was very ridiculous, and that was the only way that you had a shot at winning this round. Two key clashes. The first clash is that which side gets more opportunities. And our argument was remarkably simple. We said that we got more economic opportunities. First of all, on the individual level, that it was very hard for someone in southern Tamil Nadu to go into a place like Delhi and be able to access opportunities because everyone in Delhi spoke languages like Hindi. We were able to give people access to more mobility. They can move into the urban areas and get job opportunities because they speak the same language as people. They were even able to move to places like the United States and UK and provide for their families and send remittances back that massively built up the economies in these developing countries. We gave you arguments about investment, how it's easier to tap into higher skilled labor if everyone's educated in things like English and French, how it's easier to market to consumers, how it's easier to attract tourism into these countries. Their responses were at best mitigatory. They're like, all the majority speak a certain local language. Obviously, we changed that on our side of the house. Second of all, they're like, companies are just never going to set up shop in developing countries because it's easier to do things like brain drain. This is so not true. Companies have an incentive to establish shop in developing countries because there's massive consumer markets and massive labor markets. The only side that incentivizes those companies to invest and give access to high skill opportunities was our side of the job. And their final response is people are going to learn on the job. Are you being ridiculous? It is incredibly hard for someone to learn English in a span of a year or two. That's why we get way more opportunities in terms of tourism and labor, because from a young age, people are educated and they learn these kinds of things. What was their argument about opportunities? They said parents are going to pull their kids out of schools. First of all, no, there weren't. Again, the time lag argument just didn't apply. But second of all, there's so many other reasons why parents put their kids into school. You need to learn math. You need to learn science. You need to learn all these other languages. I don't think parents, because their cultural sovereignty is threatened, means they want their kid to just be out on the streets. Their other argument is it's easier to learn other languages that are in your region. Guys, I speak Malayalam and I've tried and I have no idea how to speak Hindi because they're so incredibly different. It was a massive assertion for them to say, just because you live in the same countries, that everyone is going to be able to learn this language. But I want to know that their counterfactual was far, far worse. That it wouldn't be a foreign language that was standardized. It would be a majoritarian language. And the majoritarian communities would have greater advantages. Their were more likely to get jobs. They were more likely to get into the best schools because from a young age, they had that advantage. The minorities on their side of the house never had that advantage because they had no access to those majoritarian languages. The second clash is which side gets greater unity. Their only argument is about how richer people have greater access to foreign languages. Number one, this is responded in Ollie's framing. They already tell you that richer individuals already have the capability to better educate themselves, to access better opportunities and learn foreign language. The real inequality in this debate was not between the rich and the poor. It was between the majority and the minority. The majority were the ones that had the privilege and the better access to language. On our side of the house, regardless of your class or income, you could go to a public school and learn English and get access to job opportunities. Panel, I want to know that the majority of our analysis under unity is either agreed with or completely conceded. Our argument about fragmentation and how that leads to local infighting and civil conflict is never dealt with. Our argument about majority oppression and how this was going to harm minority groups, never dealt with. All of our reasons as to how we get better communication and better collaboration and connection with these countries was never dealt with. There is so much analysis in this debate that they just try to wave down in their one, but completely stands and outweighs their case. Our third substantive argument is how we improve educational quality and schools get better resources. There are two reasons for this. First of all is that we get better educational resources. Schools that operate in local languages have limited resources available that they can use. This often means that schools don't have any standardized materials they can use internally because it's often up to these communities and these teachers to produce them. This puts high burdens on teachers that are already underpaid, and children often don't have access to things like textbooks. If you live in a really niche community, it's really hard to mass produce things like textbooks, mass produce things like education materials. The comparative on our side of the house is that these massive world languages already solve back for those costs. It was far easier for a child to learn a language like English or learn a language like Arabic because all the resources already existed. But second of all, we got more external funding. We were able to allow schools to partner with like international and foreign universities, like Ving University partners with Cornell. Part of the reason is because they have this common language of English that they can work through. They have similar educational paradigms. What this means is two things, right? First of all the inequality claims are either symmetric or worse on their side of the house. And second of all, on every single metric, we get better resources. It's never been a clearer proposition ballot. Thank you.
For those eloquent remarks. Now I'd like to call on the opposition.
Hi, can everybody hear me if I speak like this? Thank you. The problem with proposition in this debate is that they take far too much for granted. Even after our first speech, they still haven't given us any structural reasons why this education will be well funded, particularly to the most vulnerable rural communities, or any structural reasons why English will be taught well in these schools even when it is a totally foreign language. Their problem is that they take far too much for granted. They assume that every country like Singapore has millions and billions of dollars to invest in their education system when there are other pressing public needs. What we told you was a far more realistic characterization of developing countries like Korea and Japan, that were very poor post-colonization or in the immediate aftermath of independence, but were able to grow their economies through a focus on a local language. Even if it was not the language that everyone in the country spoke, it was the language that everyone was familiar with, and it's the language that created the least barriers to accessing education. Two areas of response in this speech: first on increasing access to education, secondly on more economic opportunities. First on increasing access to education. The two glib responses that we get, the 5 structural reasons in the previous speech for why a local language, even if it is not the ethnic minorities' language, is more accessible, are that arbitrary borders due to colonialism means that you have no familiarity with the majority's local language, and that this will be a gradual transition. Firstly, on the point of arbitrary borders, like, it doesn't actually logically follow that you don't have some familiarity with the local language. Sure, an arbitrary border may have divided a community, but it did not artificially push communities together where they previously did not exist and coexist with one another, which is why there are already many linguistic similarities between languages like Hindi and Tamil, particularly where it concerns basic numeracy and literacy. But the second response that I want to make on their point on gradual tensions is that they never illustrate what these gradual tensions look like, presumably because the transition rather cannot be gradual. Like, what are you going to do? Translate the first 5 pages of the textbook into English and have the rest of it in the local language? Any kind of language transition necessarily has to be a binary. It has to be an immediate transition. So even if you pick one group of students and choose to teach them solely in English, it will be the case that their parents lack familiarity with that language, that they cannot help them in education, and the likelihood of dropping out is far more likely. No, thank you. What is the only response that we get in the previous speech to this point on access? First, they say that ethnic majorities will have more of an advantage in education because they are more familiar with the language than the ethnic minority. I have 2 responses to this. Firstly, it is unlikely to be the case, particularly if we focus on early education, that we give ethnic majorities a significant advantage over ethnic minorities. This is because when you are very young, all languages are relatively foreign and new to you. So if we focus on local language education, particularly in pre-K or in primary education, the ability for us to bridge this disparity before it becomes too insurmountable, before familiarity with the local language is something that uniquely the ethnic majority has access to, is far, far greater. Secondly, ethnic minorities, independent of the education system, have far greater methods of learning and having access to the majority local language rather than English. Firstly, the majority local language is far more ubiquitous in the countries in which they live. Advertising, politics, newspapers, all of this is vastly written in the majority local language, given the electoral incentive for politicians to try to cater to local populations. We will point to magazines and newspapers in India, for example, that are largely disseminated and distributed in Hindi. Secondly, often internal migration within a country due to the incentive to seek economic opportunities in rural and urban regions means that the communities within these countries are more ethnically diverse, which gives you opportunities to speak and practice the language. Their comparative is online services like Duolingo that might be accessible to some people, but for the most rural communities are far less accessible than going down to the shop and talking to someone who is from the ethnic majority that speaks the foreign language. The second response that they give is that there's an incentive not to drop out from schools because parents want to teach their kids math and science. This is true. The problem is, this is logically prior to our argument that there is a massive time lag. Parents don't see their children learning math and science, they see them learning a foreign language where they are already struggling in comparison to the ethnic majority. Briefly, I want to bring back the 5 structural reasons we gave you in our previous speech about why ethnic minorities are far less likely to have familiarity with languages like English and French, and why that is bad. Firstly, in comparison to majority language, there is no common linguistic background. The syntax and grammar of English can be incredibly confusing for somebody who learns a language like Mandarin Chinese. No, thank you. Secondly, this is about a transition that happens in the present. What happens when your parents have been exclusively taught in the majority language and they thought they could help you through education, but now they realize that you're being taught in English, a language that they don't understand and that they have never learned themselves? Thirdly, colonial history had an incentive not to disseminate English, but rather the majority local language, particularly in more rural communities. Fourthly, migration internally within the country, particularly pre-colonially, which is the vast majority of these countries' histories, means that there was an incentive for the majority local language to be more widely disseminated. Now look, we agreed that ethnic minorities might be at a comparative disadvantage with ethnic majorities in terms of familiarity with the majority local language. But forcing them to learn a totally foreign language, something that the ethnic majority probably has a greater comparative advantage in, versus something that they do not know at all, is far, far more harmful. Why is it that it is uniquely the ethnic majority that has familiarity with languages like English and French? Firstly, they are most likely to have parents that work in the kinds of fancy foreign MNCs or go to university in Western countries, which worsens that comparative advantage. Secondly, they probably live in the most urbanized regions of the country where things like English advertising or English companies or foreign foreign MNCs are more likely to exist. So if they wanted to talk about a disparity, it was their side that proliferated this disparity. Now, I'm going to be reasonable. Let's say that it is true that we temporarily give ethnic majorities, despite my analysis about intervention at an early stage, we temporarily give ethnic majorities an advantage in education. Why do we think this is still better for both those majorities and the minorities? The first thing is, I think we're being far too dismissive of ethnic majorities in this debate. Yes, it is true that they are relatively privileged in comparison to the minority, but they can still be poor, they can still be vulnerable, they can still live in rural communities that lack access to education. The comparative on their side of the house is that they make it difficult for everyone to access education because they all put them in a situation where they have to learn a totally foreign language. Before I go, yes.
At best, all your arguments are an argument about a time frame. Like, they're true for the first 25 years, but after English spreads throughout the country and all the children learn it, we solve back for all the harms of unfamiliarity you talk about.
My second response linked to this point is that on their side of the house, if there is not an immediate pickup of English, which is if minority students are more likely to drop out, this creates a vicious cycle. You're less likely to send your children to school if you have no access to primary education yourself and therefore have to work a lower paying job. So they permanently lock out the most vulnerable from accessing education. Comparatively on our side of the house, majority local languages means sustained funding for education because the government has an incentive to proliferate this because they see it being adopted and succeeding even in rural communities where dropping out is more likely. I want to point out then how winning this clash on increasing access to education wins us the debate. Firstly, their arguments about fragmentation and self-rule are predicated on the premise that it is majority local languages that are inaccessible to the ethnic majority rather than English. Picking English actually means that you far more likely separate Tamil people from being able to enter the national fold because it is a language that they're historically less familiar with. So it wins on that point. Secondly, we win on their other clash about economic opportunities as well. Because their clash on economic opportunities was hung on learning a very high bar of English, enough to attend a foreign university or work in a foreign MNC. Comparatively, we think that learning the majority local language is at a far lower bar, given the structural reasons for why it is true, and it is also more useful. The reason in the previous speech about why it is important to learn a foreign language and why MNCs go to developing countries is because there are local populations and local workforces. Well, if you're catering to the local population, it is the majority local language that you need to learn as an ethnic minority rather than a foreign language. So for this reason, the marginal benefit of even learning a little more of the majority local language, not just being able to speak it, but also read and write in it, is far greater on our side of the house. Secondly, we would point out that there are structural incentives for tourists and migrant laborers to have sufficient access to ESL education because companies themselves disseminate it. Like the ladies in the lunch canteen are able to communicate reasonably quite well, and I think that's sufficient for most tourism and service sector economies. For all of these reasons, we win the debate.
We thank the speaker for those colorful remarks, and now I'd like to call the Prop 3 of the podium.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Side opposition all throughout today's round was very insistent on arguing against their own reality, a world in which rural communities simply cannot provide English education to their children, a world in which parents and their kids can never break out of the cycle of not knowing foreign languages, a major world languages. But if you want to break out of a cycle, you need to take that first step, and that is what we stood for under our side of the house. In this speech, I'm going to discuss two main areas of clash. Firstly, on access to education. Here I'll clash with the vast majority of their claims. And second, assuming that we do get access to education, on which side is that education more valuable for societal purposes, for economic purposes? First, on access to education. Side opposition's main claim here is that parents will pull their children out of schools insofar as there is a high linguistic barrier to entering into those schools. You don't understand English, so you can't go to science class, and you can't pick up material that quickly. I want to note a few main responses here. Firstly, as I told you in our second speech, in our third argument, never meaningfully engaged with, was that there are far more resources to learn English, to learn major world languages, than most local languages. And the reason for this is because there's simply a larger world-speaking population of that language. There's more media, for instance, that is English media than media that is local language media, which means that under our side of the house, there are simply more educational resources, media resources, for you to do so. But I also want to note here that they just severely underestimate the brains of young children. The fact that you're able to learn a vocabulary so quickly, even if you're 10 years old and newly entering to school, this is what we see with lots of ESL kids who are able to develop proficiency in that language over time. Secondly, this argument is just built on an uncharitable and unreasonable assertion of how this program will play out. We're happy to support a pilot program where you do things, for instance, like you introduce English in year 11 at first, and then you gradually bring it down to more elementary schools, etc. We think governments have every incentive to do so to ensure that they do get children attending these schools. But moreover, you can have things like teachers who can teach in both languages, assist their students. We don't think that this was an unreasonable or unrealistic claim to make in this round. But thirdly, even if it is true that there is a higher linguistic barrier to learning English or another major world language, we also said that the reward of learning that language was just far, far higher under our side of the house, which meant that even if you had to suffer through a few hours of English class and you simply did not understand what the teacher was saying, you're willing to do so insofar as oftentimes these communities engage in some glorification of the Western world where a lot of opportunities lie, where the bastion of employment is, and therefore they're more willing to put in the time, their families are willing to send them to that school, even if it's a more risky bet. The last thing to note here is that you're more likely to pull kids out of school under their side of a house when you feel there's very little benefit to entering into that school in the first place. If I can already teach my kid this local language, and I presumably do it better because I know things like, sayings between people, presumably it is the case that you simply lose a huge incentive to actually send their kids into school. So for those reasons we said, access to school was likely symmetric under both sides of a house. They could not prove a significant margin. If anything, they lost access under their side of a house. But even if you buy into their timeline issue that you don't know English and therefore you're never willing to learn English, I think that we already told you that this was solely a short-run issue that we could easily outweigh on. We said that we could easily address this by rolling out a pilot program, recognize that this is not an immediate process. We already see populations all around the world gradually picking up English with their parents. We don't think it takes a lot for their parents to do things like pick up small piece of language here and there and help their kids out. But in the long term, when your parents do know this language, because they also went through that educational system, you essentially broke down that linguistic barrier to every extent under their side of a house. And long-term benefits are just far exceptionally more important than the short-term concerns that they had, insofar as they repeat over time. They repeat over decades and decades of economic development under our side of a house that was far more important than the short-term concerns of this timeline issue that we could very easily address. On to the second theme, and the far more important clash in today's round, about which side's education is actually more valuable. Now, the first thing I want to do here is just recap all the claims that we gave you under our side, was they failed to engage with two speeches already. Firstly, they have economic benefits insofar as they can do things like inspire foreign direct investment into your country. That at the point at which your labor force speaks a major world language, they're able to provide productive labor towards these companies. Their response is to say that these companies have an incentive to pull labor out rather than move into these countries. This is simply not true. There are so many strong incentives to move into these developing countries. You want to globalize your supply chain. That is why Apple and Samsung do run out of places like China, for instance, as opposed to staying strictly in the US. Moreover, it's cheaper to purchase land and build up your factories there. But then you also tap into a new market of people under our side of a house at the point at which you can also market to them, since they understand this world language too. So there was just so many reasons why these companies were interested in moving into these countries, and they would be able to do so under our side of a house at the point in which there was an existent labor force there. Secondly, we told you that we could also access more employment under our side of a house. But the greatest possible employable skill that you could have is English. As they say, you need to understand English to gradually learn more things. If your company wants to teach you something, they're going to teach you that in English. That means that all the benefits of learning more and more on the skill, on the job, means that you're presumably only able to access all of those skills as well under our side of a house. That is why English or another major world language was presumably the greatest employable skill that you could possibly have. I think the only bit of response we could really credit them for is only brain drain and why that is harmful for countries. I want to note firstly, brain drain occurs equally under their side of a house insofar as there are some very wealthy communities with private education, so the coveted scientists and doctors presumably already leaving under their side of a house. Second, brain drain happens when you don't have employment opportunities back home. But clearly you don't want the emotional toll of having to leave your family, the cultural expense of not being able to live in your neighborhood and go to the church that you grew up going to. So presumably you only leave home when you don't have employment opportunities back at home. We bring them home to these individuals. In a second. The last thing to note here is that we can also reverse brain train insofar as now people are speaking the same language. This is why you see a lot of like English not cooperatives, like corporations also moving into places like Shanghai, into China, insofar as they now have like a population they can tap into there, people that they can employ. So you also have like reverse brain train. Doctors might move back into these developing countries at the point in which they can actually communicate with their patients and provide services there. Before I move on, I'll take the point.
We never said that brain drain was bad. In fact, we said that FDI, for the reasons that you give of wanting to cater to a local population and access a local market and a local labor force, was more likely if everyone was more proficient in the local language, i.e. being able to read and write in the majority language and cater to customers in that
No,
language.
I just don't think that's true for two reasons. Firstly, you're likely to already have expertise in a local language, but you still speak that at home under our side of a house, so that's symmetric. What you now learn is a new language as well, so you just have more employable skills. And second, the vast majority of opportunities due to things like colonialism are just locked up in like English institutions and English universities that you want to go to. Those are like the top-ranking universities, the best and biggest corporations. I don't think they can just say that because you speak a local language, you also get employment under their side of the house. So at the end of this, though, we also had an outstanding claim on the cultural unity and the national unity that you get under our side of a house. At the point in which you bridge things like local barriers, at the point in which you didn't have to understand the majoritarian language, but everyone within the nation understood things like English. Also, this means that you can access lots of cultural benefits insofar as you're able to do things like preserve your language and make it mainstream, communicate with more people, learn more things. The only reason why we're at WSDC is because we know English. We know that oftentimes you need the skill to actually interact with people. The last thing to note here is just on principle as well, and why this was also sufficient to win us this debate. But what we told you was that this was important for equality, that if you wanted any choice in your life, if you wanted opportunities in your life, having English and education in English was the only way to access any of those, and that was a gateway to the vast majority of choices that individuals would make. So on that basis, we're very happy to propose.
I thank the speaker for those eloquent remarks and would like to call the third opposition speaker to the podium.
Hi, is this volume audible? Thank you. Panel, the problem with the proposition is that they do not recognize that the world is messy. We do. We recognize that regardless of whatever educational model developing countries choose to adopt, there are going to be some problems on either side of the house. We think that it is better for all children in a given country to learn in a language that they have already had some exposure to, that they already grew up to at least some extent being able to speak and being able to interact with. What they suggest is that forcing a language that no one has ever spoken down those children's throats is likely to lead to better educational outcomes. If this sounds unintuitive, this is a problem that they had to fix. And this is probably why their strategy down the bench has been evolving to such a significant extent that I just think that they don't know what they're talking about. Because in their second speech, their biggest winning margin is that they want to decrease ethnic tension. But in their third speech, once we sufficiently responded to that, all they say is that they get more FDI. You know what the problem with that part to victory is? Our analysis in our second argument in Op 1 unresponded to as to why FDI is more likely on our side when more people have completed basic education education as opposed to some people speaking English and the vast majority of people being locked out of being able to access a high school degree. So if they wanted to point and say that one side wasn't engaging, maybe they should point at themselves and engage with our second argument earlier. I'm going to talk about two things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about increasing access to education and why that's the most important clash in this debate. Secondly, I'll be charitable and win on their own metric of economic development. First question then, about increasing access to education. Quickly, I want to weigh why this clash is the most important clash in this debate, because we would suggest that access to education is the prerequisite to getting any of the economic development benefits that they want to talk about. We would suggest that their inability to have a majority of the workforce completing things like secondary education means that they lack the huge educated workforce that their first speaker suggests is the prerequisite for things like FDI or factories setting up in their country as well. So insofar as we prove that they increase rates of dropout from school entirely, they lose on both of their paths to victory. So let's talk about why that is likely. I want to be really clear here. Both sides have barriers. I'm not going to pretend that our side is perfect either. The problem is that their side forces all children to learn English or French or a language that they have no familiarity with. What we do is we have minorities learn the majority language that is already prevalent within the country. So then this debate is about which of these barriers is easier to overcome for the majority of the population within these countries. Insofar we prove our barrier is lower, their case is out. Here's why our barrier is lower. Because every single poor person on their side of the house is locked out of accessing that completely foreign language from scratch to begin with. And I would note that poor people are very important. A, because they're vulnerable, but B, we're talking about developing countries panel. For the vast majority of people, they don't have the huge amount of disposable income required to be able to teach their children a new language from scratch as well. P3 points out that online media exists, but this is not true for the poorest people as well. These are the people who don't have a stable enough internet connection to access things like Duolingo. But even if they could, you know what's better than Duolingo? Having a teacher in your local community who speaks the majority language as opposed to having to depend on Duolingo because no one in your rural community speaks English at all in the very first place. So I'm just going to weigh these things out on numbers. You know who's locked out? Every single poor person who cannot access Duolingo or who cannot import an English teacher from the city center. Those are the people who get locked out of the education system on their side. On our side, it is true that minorities are locked out if they cannot learn the majority's language. So let's look at the analysis why we provided those minorities will be able to access the majority's language down the bench. We gave you 4 reasons in Ashwin's speech. First, we pointed out that there is massive linguistic similarity between different languages in the same region. P2 very glibly says that he speaks Malayalam, but he can't learn Hindi because these are very distinct. But you know what? It's probably more similar than Hindi is to English, because the reason why these languages are similar is because in a geographic region, the way that languages evolved is by splintering off of a common root in the very first place. So structurally, these languages are more similar than any of your languages are to English. Anecdotal evidence is not analysis. It is not enough to do that in reply. But even if you buy that claim entirely, additional mechanisms never responded to. First, we pointed out that missionaries spread their education in the local majority language in that region. So you didn't have Japanese minorities in Japan being taught in their own languages, but they were taught in Japanese when missionaries spread there because the missionaries couldn't afford to translate into multiple different languages. Thirdly, we pointed out that it is far more likely that you get local migration from rural areas than you get international migration and exposure to English. Lastly, we pointed out that people in these rural areas probably speak the majority language anyway out of economic necessity because they probably need to do so in order to survive in the majoritarian economy as well. So we pointed out that access to these barriers and to breaching them is far easier on our side of the house. We pointed out what this means is that the time lag in terms of education paying off is far higher on their side of the house. They have to teach a new language from scratch. And what that means is that parents don't see the value of education paying off and are far more likely to take their children out of school because those children could be helping out at home instead, could be working on the farm instead. There's a massive opportunity cost of sending kids to school that parents are less willing to take on their side. Our side starts teaching them faster. Our side starts paying value off faster, which means that education is more likely to be completed on our side of the house. So we think that their side actually has the higher barriers and therefore less completion of education. But I want to be extremely charitable. The best version of the argument that their side presents is that both the Tamil and Chinese children in Singapore are equally unfamiliar with English, which is why they do not have the same minority-based oppression that they claim we have. But this is not structurally true either. The richest people in those communities are the people who come from majoritarian communities, which is why in Singapore, Chinese people are richer than the Indian Tamil children in those regions. So actually, those people have better access to English as well, so they actually increase the burden on those minority Tamil kids far more. You now have to learn an entirely new language, and an entirely new language that the Mandarin kid probably speaks much better anyway to begin with. So in terms of barriers, they lock out far more people of education than we do. Our access to education is much better because we ensure that these minority children can access this education. This is important because we think that the priority in developing countries is ensuring that a lot of people complete education, not ensuring that they can migrate elsewhere. The priority is getting these people good jobs in the country that they already exist, as opposed to condemning them to unemployment. Before my second dash.
Most people in developing countries are not rich, so the class differences between the majority and minority are pretty small. The bigger disparity is which language you're more familiar with.
I'm confused. If most people aren't rich, that's the reason why they are oppressed by the rich. We would suggest that the most people not being rich is exactly the reason why we ought to care about the people who are poor in these countries. Second question then about economic development. We pointed out a range of reasons why economic development isn't actually exclusive to their side. Ashin pointed out that FDI is more likely when people have a basic education and can work in a factory, as opposed to some people speaking English but a majority of the population not having a secondary education. P2 says that there's a massive labor market in developing countries and a massive economic market that these companies can sell to. This is true. This is also why you will expand to those developing countries regardless of whether they speak English, because you still want to sell to them. Their claim is that somehow you can't translate marketing or working instructions at all. Why is this remotely true? If people have an education and economic development enough to buy products, you expand to developing countries anyway. What is the comparative benefit on their side? Education is the most important impact in the debate, because even if they get some FDI on their side, it only goes to the richest of the rich, the most urban areas, given our unresponded to second argument about why rich urban divides become far more significant. Their development only helps the richest anyway. For those reasons, oppose.
We thank the speaker for those opening remarks, and now we'll open the replies. I'd like to call on over.
Volume check. Fine. Okay. I think what that POI to Thitira illustrated is the underlying problem in strategy with the proposition, which is that they just fundamentally misunderstand developing countries. Developing countries have a massive class divide. They have massive disparities between the very rich and the very poor, and that is a problem. This is why their priorities in this debate are skewed. Because big MNCs and getting into the best universities don't matter nearly as much as being able to get any education at all and being able to survive locally. In fact, we flip this. We proved the prerequisite to getting any sort of foreign investment is having an educated workforce, period. That is the fundamental benefit we gain on our side, and their glib response of people will send their kids to school anyway fundamentally misses the point. The only real push then they have remaining is this idea on ethnic division. But this ignores Chanidu's response in second, which is that even for ethnic minorities, the most important thing to prevent them from being locked out of society is having access to the majority language and access to the ability to communicate. In addition, for minorities, Thitira's analysis proved that the most important thing is getting education at all, because class tracks onto race in these countries. That is the difference. Two paths to victory for the opposition. Firstly, in terms of access to education at all. I want to note the minimal response to our second argument, which is still important in this debate, that you concentrate resources in the hands of urban areas, that you structurally create an incentive to pool all the resources in the hands of already rich cities. The problem problem then is one of differentiating ethnicity and class. In terms of even the poorest or most marginalized ethnicities, it is much easier to learn a local majority language. This is the winning analysis. The linguistic similarities, the fact that you are much more likely to have access to other people than you are to the internet, the fact that you have more local teachers you can talk to, the fact that you historically learned the language means that you have more access to the majority language than you will ever be able to have to English. Why then is class important? Because of the vicious cycle we proved in terms of the urban-rural divide that continues to exist. Because even the majority in these nations tend to be richer than the minority. So even if they are both equally unfamiliar at the beginning, it will always be the majority that has the upper hand. Track this instead to a world where you teach everyone the majority language. It is a much more level playing field. That is what they have failed to engage with. But the fundamental crux of this argument panel is the idea of people dropping out. The only reasons they say they will not is because parents want their kids to learn science and math. Potentially we agree. But in the context of developing countries where child labor is highly enticing, this is a trade-off that people have to make. The problem then was the time lag. They want to say the time lag goes away. But if the time lag, as Chanidu proved to you, means that people don't get education now, it means that their kids don't get education either, panel. That is a difference. We had unresponded analysis in terms of the higher burden on parents. In terms of late beginners who will constantly be at a disadvantage. Their silver bullet here was the word gradual. But this can't be gradual because you need to create the shift from a young age. Even if so, our reasons are independent because it's about the cost to parents. Even if this is a gradual process, it's still much worse off, and you create an incentive to pull out. All of this means people don't get an education at all, which is far worse than having even a potentially subpar education, which we don't think it is. Second clash then in terms of the quality of education. I want to note the lack of response to the analysis on the utility of the language. Knowing your local language is very, very important because even foreign MNCs wanted to cater to local populations, especially considering their own example of moving into China where almost nobody widespreadly speaks English. The fact of the matter is this: most people will never work in an English-speaking company. What they will need in a developing country is the access to education. That is the difference. But the foreign language is the local language is much more utile for employment because even in big cities, it is less prominent than the local language. And we think that if they want to claim ethnic division, the most important thing is that you can communicate with the majority at all and get some sort of education. Their side locks you out entirely. Fundamentally, their side is one that has a problem with misprioritization, and that is why they lose.
I think this video for those eloquent remarks, and I'd like to call on the appropriate flag to close the debate. Here we go.
Everyone good? I want to start this speech by telling a story about my cousin Madhav, who lives in Kerala, India. Now, when Madhav was 5 years old, his parents sent him to a mainly English school. They were only instructed in English, right? And Madhav's parents spoke in Malayalam. So when Madhav came back and started speaking to his parents in English, they weren't like, "This is terrifying. We're taking you out of school, Madhav." They were like, "Madhav, it's great that you learn English because now you have a shot, just like your friend Vinayak, to go in the United States and get a job and get opportunities." Madhav graduated and now he's going to Oxford. They were very uncharitable. They were just like, they didn't want to actually debate the debate on the grounds of whether or not there was a utility of learning a foreign language. They just wanted to be like, parents are so terrified and won't learn foreign languages, so just no one goes to school. You know this is ridiculous. I know this is ridiculous. They probably know it's ridiculous too. All right. Quickly, I want to hit some things on framing and then to go into the two key clashes of this debate. First, on framing, they make an argument that you don't learn your local language. As we told you in ARM framing, people are likely to be bilingual, so that access to local language opportunities were likely symmetric. Secondly, on things like class divides are likely to be non-unique. If I'm rich, I can speak Hindi better than you, and I could also speak English better than you. The real difference was on majority and minority populations, because an ethnically Hindi speaker was always able to easily speak it better than things like Tamil. On our side of the house, we were able to standardize this, where everyone was able to speak things like English. This is why we beat their arguments about the urban-rural divide, because on their side of the house, if I live in a really niche rural community that speaks a certain language, I can never move to urban centers like Delhi and compete with people that are speaking in Hindi. On our side of the house, now you can, because everyone there is speaking English. All their arguments about class divides that they collapsed on massively in the reply now flow to us. Huge offensive win for us, clean ballot. Two clashes. First clash is about the access to education. Second, it's on the economy. On the the access to education, 3 major responses. First of all, governments had an incentive to increase access to education. We told you this from the one, that there would be a gradual process, that they would invest well into these programs, they would ensure that there's teachers, and we told you it was even easier to equip teachers with resources because these major languages were very, very cheap. You could easily give people access to things like educational materials. This was likely to be a gradual process to happen over years and years, which means the argument about time lag simply did not matter. Second of all, we told you that parents were likely to buy into people learning foreign languages. This was the argument that came out in Chelsea's 3 that was never answered, that people glorified learning foreign languages because the West was a beacon of capital and economic success and prosperity. So even if I didn't understand my kid, I still wanted them to learn English because I knew that you could get more job opportunities in English. But third of all, we argue, and they concede in their second speech, that it's not that hard for kids to learn language. If I'm a kindergartner, Hindi and English are equally foreign to me. So on our side of the house and on their side of the house, kids are probably going to learn the language either way. For these 3 reasons, the access to education is symmetric, and if anything, we increase the incentive for people to access things like education. Then moving on to the argument about the economy. Their only responses here are twofold. First of all, they say most people are going to be uneducated. This is incredibly contingent on their case. I think that falls out of the debate. But second of all, they're like, rich people are better able to access these kinds of opportunities. We told you this wasn't true, that the vast majority of people were able to access foreign languages. We gave you so many reasons why this was good for individuals. They could get things like greater mobility, that if I lived in a tiny rural community, I didn't just know that language, I knew English, which made me employable across my country and across the world. We told you this attracted investment. We gave you lines of analysis that were untouched until the op block, and then they started reading new responses about how foreign investment was inevitable. Number 1, this is new. Number 2, it wasn't inevitable. When a population is more skilled, when they're able to better communicate with consumers, when you have increased levels of tourism, these were all unique benefits on our side of the house. These skilled populations meant that you increase investment. It's the reason why Singapore was 10 times more developed than Malaysia. The reason why this economy argument is so important is because it outweighs all of their cases. We argue that on our side of the house, everyone benefited. It wasn't just the richest. It was people that are getting access to factories, to more jobs, to higher incomes. Because when Singapore started their project, they weren't a rich country. They were a bunch of swamps. On our side of the house, we allowed them to develop economically. Here's the bottom line of the debate. Access to education was symmetric. We were the only side that uniquely got economic benefits. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for those eloquent remarks and thank both of you for a pleasant, enjoyable debate. Please, close the aisle, shake hands, and everyone leave for 20 minutes. Thank you.